You're listening to Errol Parker and Clancy Overall, editors of the Batuta Advocate, on Desert Rock FM. Hello. Thank you for tuning in to the Batuta Advocate radio show here on Desert Rock FM. My name is Clancy Overall, and joining me for today's chat is Errol Parker. He's just out the back of the moment, taking a phone call from our local member, David Littleproud. It seems the implosion of the coalition government is imminent because, I mean, we know he'll probably get re-elected in this great reckoning of the May election, but I don't think many other people will, and they probably won't be in power. So he's just asking for a few favours, as these political types often do, but he's certainly not going to get them here, although we do appreciate the support of our local member. Now, we've made our way back out to the desert after an amazing nationwide tour with the Batuta Advocate Roadshow. And we're finally being able to settle down into the festive season, sitting out here in the 50-degree heat we're so used to out here in the Channel Country. Coming to you live today from the Koala Mattress studio down on Daru Street. Yes, thank you to our podcast sponsors, Koala Mattresses. You can go to their website for a cheap mattress today. It'll save you a lot of running around if you are looking to spruce up your sleep hygiene. They've got all the things you need there. Now, our guest this week is actually a master of storytelling, and he's incredibly well versed in the Australian laconic type humour and storytelling. Spent a lot of time out in the bush as a teacher, spent a lot of time in the city as a teacher, and really is from the same school as the Lawson Pattersons. Toured with Slim Dusty, in fact. He's done a fair bit of time out in the pubs, as we've learnt with this new book he's written. And we sat down with him in our little makeshift studio when we were down in Sydney for the roadshow. His name is Jim Haynes, and he's just released a book called Best Australian Drinking Stories, which is in all good bookstores right now, and it is a great read. So without further ado, here is this week's show. Jim Haynes, how are you, mate?
Oh, I'm good. Lovely to be here and catch you before you head back.
That's a great sort of voice you got there. That's a great smooth radio voice.
Oh, well, I did start my career in country radio. So
yep.
I had the first show I had on little radio station up in northern New South Wales. They used to broadcast the local rugby league. They don't do that anymore. And then there was a show called Back to the Bible, and they had nothing between it. So that was me. That was my. Nobody listened, but it was a lot of fun doing it.
And you learn your way. You are a radio background, author background, entertainer, really.
Yes, a bit of everything.
Yeah.
You have to be versatile. Be out there ducking and weaving, making a quid. You can't just do one thing. There's not enough people.
Yeah, not in Australia.
No.
You could get away with that in the States, can't you? People in the States have made careers out of wobble boards and that kind of stuff.
You can have a niche career in the USA, and I remember Geraldine Doyle. Remember her wonderful Irish comedian, and she used to tour the States very successfully. And I said to her once, "How do you do it?" And she said, "Well, there's an Irish circuit."
Yeah, right.
Which is only small, only niche, only about 25 million people. But that's it. Away you go.
Yeah. And as you know, Australians do get that too. We got the Arj Barkers and Jamoans. A lot of these guys end up setting up shop here if they can do it, I guess. But when you come from a country like Ireland, 4 million people. 25 million people in Australia looks like a big market, doesn't it?
That's a big step up for some of those people.
Yeah. Now you've just written a book, Jim. We've had a read of it. It's a great yarn. It is going to be in a lot of coffee tables on Christmas Day, I reckon, because it's got those stories in them that your dad's going to want to read. And it's the best Australian drinking stories. Yeah,
look, a lot of people buy my books, which do tend to come out around this time of the year, best Australian racing stories, best Australian sea stories, aviation stories, always seem to come out around this late November, early December, and people buy them for Uncle Fred, who's difficult to buy for, and that's what he gets for Christmas. Whether he reads it or not, I have no idea, but a lot of... I sign a lot of them, to Uncle Fred, Merry Christmas.
So what number is this one?
This is number 26.
Jesus, wept.
Yeah. Now, you and I think you've actually tapped into the more, like Uncle Fred, he's hard to buy for, because there's a bit of history in your books, but there's also a lot of colloquialism and a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's a balancing act between the history. The history's become more important to me over the years. Like this one started off as just a collection of very funny and amusing and sad as well stories about drinking. There's stories by Ken Cook, Henry Lawson, but then once you start to look at why they were the way they were, and quite a few of them were alcoholics. Lawson was an alcoholic, Lenny Lowe was an alcoholic, C.J. Dennis. Then you start to inadvertently collect the history, and you realise that we come from a nation who had a prime minister whose claim to fame was that he was in the Guinness World Book of Records for being the best beer drinker in the world.
Yeah.
And we had rum was our currency for 18 years, and we had this stupid 6 o'clock closing thing, which gave us a society where men and women were separated, and all sorts of social evils, crime, police corruption, all because of this link that seems more in our history than any other nation, the link between our history and alcohol.
So did you start to collate these stories at the start of this year, or has this been a lifelong endeavour, really?
Yeah, they sort of evolve. You know, one of the worst things about doing what I do is I sometimes write a book about something about which I know very little. One of my most successful books was the book of Australian trucking stories, right. and you can see by looking at me, I'm not a sort of particularly rugged trucker, but luckily I did tour with Slim Dusty and I had some contacts, and the trucking stories rolled in, and the book was very successful. I researched the history of trucking in Australia, which you can do. You only have to be one step ahead of your readers. And now I've got so many stories since then that we're probably ready for volume 2. Once you finish the book, all the good stories come in.
Yeah. It's like a bit of Catch Me If You Can, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Stay one head a week.
Sometimes I've done 3 books of racing stories because I'm a racing tragic. But, with some of the others, you think, oh, do I really want to write another book of aviation stories? But the stories always come in at the end.
Now, tell us with the railway stories, did you really strike a vein there? Because they are tragics.
Absolutely. When I did the railway book, I did it with a mate of mine who has luggage racks on the walls of his house and has crockery with railway on it, like he is a nut. This guy's a nut. And you need someone like that, because if you make a mistake with those railway people, we used to do a show too where we did the history of railways. We sang a few songs, did some poems, and I had this whistle. I used to, got it down in Salamanca Market, woo, woo, and we did a show for retired railwaymen, and we had 2 complaints as they were leaving. And one was that we provided a railway meal. And one bloke said, that wasn't a railway meal. It was way too good to be a railway meal. That was one complaint. The other bloke said, well, he said, only one thing. He said, that whistle you were blowing when you sang that song? I said, yeah. He said, well, that wasn't the whistle that was on the train that you were singing about. So they know it all, and writing about what you don't know, that's why, if I stick to racing and alcohol, I'm in pretty safe territory.
yeah, right. Well, you find that with these things, once you start scratching the surface on it, you find the right guy to talk to, and there's an underground network. Is that what
absolutely. Yeah. That was really true of the trucking stories. I discovered a bloke who put together the Tar Cutter Memorial, and I knew about that because I toured with Slim Dusty, and we always used to do a free show down there. And from there, it just sort of snowballed out. There were all these other people and great stories, and people. Aussies generally they just love telling you the stories. You've got to talk to my mate. It's usually quite a nice experience to put a book together, and everybody, is keen and helpful. And so far, I haven't done one on politics yet, but
yeah. Well, there's always going to be a treasure trove of stories that are coming out of Canberra, isn't there?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone really wants to hear them all again.
No.
But it would be. I often think of good books, but then my publishers remind me that I have to write books that people want to buy, and that stops me writing quite a few that I'd like to write. But
you could do Canberra drinking stories, because I reckon a lot of political fuck ups have happened over a few schooners.
Absolutely, when people were making decisions when they were 1 or 2 or 5 over the 8, that would be for sure.
Now tell us, between this book and you said you work with Slim Dusty, there's a lot of storytellers you've worked with. There's a lot of storytellers you've either written about or worked with. Was there a link between Slim and this Lawson era? Because Lawson, of course, his boss was Archibald, who's now...
They had some good rows.
Yeah, and they had... The Archibald Prize is now named after his former employer, and Lawson was sent out bush to dry out, which never worked.
Never.
And then, of course, Patterson, and there was all that, their rows, and then Slim used to sing songs written by both of them, probably not 100 years later, but...
a fair while later. And Lawson died in 22, and Slim loved Henry Lawson. At his memorial service, they played his favourite song, poem, whatever, which is a Lawson poem called Do You Think That I Do Not Know?, which was Slim's favourite of all time, and he did a lot of albums of Henry Lawson. And I think that, there's a letter in this book from Henry Lawson to the Bulletin, and it's so honest. It's a little letter that he wrote one night in 1903, and he said, "Why does a man drink?" And, he wrote the letter to the Bulletin asking, did anybody know why we drink? And he said, I drink because I'm sad, and then when I get happy, I drink because I'm happy. And he says, I drank because I was rejected, and I got awfully drunk when I was accepted. And, and it's a very honest letter. And, of course, a lot of his poetry was about that. And there's a poem called Sweeney, which Slim made into a song, which is really about Henry Lawson himself telling a drunk how he should behave and so on. So, Henry's a very strong link between the past and that sort of thread of alcohol that runs through, because he really invented mateship. Henry Lawson, he was a bloke who sort of wrote about it, and there's a poem he wrote called "A Mate Can Do No Wrong."
Yeah.
Wrong. Doesn't matter what he does. A mate can do no wrong. So, of course, mateship goes with alcohol in Australian history very much. And he was, an interesting character because he was jailed 9 times for non-payment of maintenance for his kids and alcoholism. But he was the first person in New South Wales to get a state funeral. So that shows you the link between alcohol and our history, doesn't it? A drunk... derelict. He had nothing at the end of his life. He was being looked after by people who he really never, showed much gratitude to be honest. And yet he's the first bloke we give a state funeral to.
Yeah.
Did they give one to Banjo?
No, he didn't get one.
Oh, well.
So
he got the absolute last laugh then, didn't he?
Well, yeah, I
guess.
Nice
guys finished last.
Yeah, and we can't even visit Banjo because he was cremated. But you mentioned J.F. Archibald, who was the editor of the Bulletin, who Lawson had massive rows with because Archibald tried to edit his work and make it better. And they're buried out at Waverley Cemetery, luckily on opposite sides of the cemetery, because I reckon if you go out there at midnight, there'd be an awful row going on out there.
Now, you tell us some of these, in what you've kind of learned about, Australian history and how it's been shaped around. And, a lot of wowsers will tell you that, the pub and the grog and, and knock-off and the 6 o'clock swill and all that kind of stuff actually didn't, shouldn't have played such a big role in the day-to-day life of Australians, but it obviously did. To the point now where you're looking at a similar setup in Sydney and Newcastle and certain towns in New South Wales where there is no night trade, and it's a similar thing. I wouldn't say it's full-blown temperance league, but, it sounds like something that people are going to have to look back on and see, geez, things got pretty grim there for a while.
Yeah, they did, and it affected us. I think it's still there today. And when I was a kid, 6 o'clock closing had ended in New South Wales, ended in 54 54, I think, or 56. So, but it was still there. Men still went and drank like crazy after work, and they didn't take their wives out for a drink or a pleasant meal and a drink because you couldn't, because women weren't allowed in that bar. And, that was the problem with the 6 o'clock closing, that it gave us this culture of drinking, boozing, shouts, because, you see, you only had a limited time. So if we went into a pub, the three of us, we could all buy 12 beers, for the shout, and so would everybody else. Saying you drink them as quickly as possible and then vomit on the way home, And the women who, lobbied for it, the Temperance League, their slogan was, "We want our men at home." Well, they got them at home, drunk, just about every night, and it was a big thing started in the 1820s, the Temperance League, and then the Salvation Army came along and boosted it. But women used to sign a pledge, "Lips that touch liquor will never touch mine." Yeah. And they were told, never marry a man who drinks, as opposed to, Barry Mackenzie's well-known saying, "Never trust a man who doesn't drink," which is more the Australian sort of, cliche, I guess. Yeah. But the 6 o'clock closing was a terrible thing. It handed crime straight into the hands of criminals, or because you couldn't drink after 6 o'clock, but somebody was going to sell it.
Yeah, So did Australia have that speakeasy culture? Did it have? Do you know if it was it? I mean, I don't know if we had the Appalachian moonshiners.
Well, I think we had a few rum stills around in the back of the days of the Rum Rebellion, but it was never that bad because it wasn't complete prohibition. Yeah. So it caused different problems, I think.
Binge drinking, for one.
Yeah, and people accepted that these laws were stupid. I think that was part of the problem. My mum was a decent, hard-working, working-class, church-going woman who'd never been in a pub in her life, but even she realised that, it was stupid, and if you wanted to buy a beer on Sunday afternoon or after 6 o'clock, there was someone who'd sell it to you, and she thought, well, what's wrong with that? So decent people accepted that these laws were pretty stupid, and that didn't that didn't help. And when the Royal Commission ended the 6 o'clock closing in New South Wales, the judge who presided said that this was an obvious evil, that it was causing all sorts of terrible social problems in our society, and of course the clubs came along as a result of after World War II. Because people needed somewhere where they could go that was, relatively decent place to have a drink and take your wife and that sort of stuff. And of course that then helped create the gambling problem because they were supported by the poker machine. So one thing leads to another.
Yeah, it's interesting to see when Clancy and I were in Melbourne on the roadshow. It seems that the pubs there, they were a lot more keen to have you in because they didn't have the poker machines, so they'd rather have a couple of piss blokes in there as opposed to having a room full of people who aren't, but the people who gamble as they do in Queensland and New South Wales.
Yeah, well, I mean that's happened in fairly recent times, hasn't it? The pubs have now got poker machines as well. It used to be clubs had pokies, but they were community centres. Pubs didn't have them. Now, the pubs have them, and that's caused the clubs to struggle. So, the thing about the 6 o'clock closing, 1916, there was a huge riot of soldiers in Liverpool, near Sydney, and they wrecked the pubs in Liverpool. They came into Sydney, and people were terrified because there were 15,000 trainee soldiers with firearms roaming the city, and that's why they voted. It was 4 months before they had the vote.
Yeah, right.
And the year before, the Labor government had said, we won't close the pubs. It used to be 11 o'clock, all across, until 1916, everywhere in Australia, 11 o'clock. They said, we won't do it, and they got elected with a healthy majority. Now, only a few months later, after the soldiers' riot, people voted 2-1 to close the pubs at 6 o'clock, thinking it seemed like a good idea at the time, but, it turned out to not be a good idea at all.
Bit of knee-jerk populism. Now, tell us, on that vein of excessive drinking, and of course that isn't the for a lot of people that doesn't define, pub culture in Australia, but for a lot of people it does. And there was one bloke in Cooper Pedy who appears in your book, who may have been sent to jail for a very long time if he drove home from the pub that night.
Oh, my heavens. Isn't it Ivan? And it's a great story. Ken Cook was a great storyteller. He was a true Aussie, and he wrote some very funny stories, and I think there are 3 or 4 in the book. But he also understood Aussies, and of course he wrote that scary novel which became a movie called Wake in Fright. Yeah. It's his story, and I know his widow quite well, so I'd never say that he'd write anything that wasn't true, but it's a bet. And of course, when you go to places like Lightning Ridge and Cooper Pedy, you're in another universe. You're in a universe of men who, haven't existed since Neanderthals died out. A lot of them.
So that silver, that opal, that silver, you see it in Broken Hill and Mount Isa a bit as well. That kind of remote madness.
Yeah. And of course, this man is the bet is that he can't drink 100 stubbies, and I'll let people find out by reading the book what happens at the end.
Yeah. How much is that? That's what's that? That's 100 times what? 375 mils?
Yeah, I've no idea, but I would have thought that nobody could survive it. But as you said, the character Ivan in that story is hardly normal.
Yeah. And also it's stubbies too, because they're that far out, they don't really have draft beer.
No, they don't have draft beer. And that's the other interesting thing about, we've always had this reputation of being a nation of beer drinkers, but, until the 1880s, it wasn't beer that people drank in outback pubs because there was no refrigeration.
Yeah.
And one of the great ironies for me is that our most famous beer overseas, Foster's, and if you've lived overseas, you spend half your time telling people we don't drink that at home because they've done such a good job of marketing it. But Foster's was actually set up by 2 American brothers who came out here to sell refrigeration.
Right.
And they went to Melbourne, and one was a bit shonky. He was being chased. He'd done a few naughty things back home, and he owed a lot of money. And they came to Melbourne to sell refrigeration, which was new technology. And they thought the best way we can show this technology is to, give people a beer and say, look at that. That's what refrigeration is. So that they created Foster's Brothers Brewery. They sold it 2 years later and went away.
Yeah.
And now it's supposed to be the most Australian beer worldwide. It was invented by Americans, and they were only here to sell fridges or refrigeration.
Tell us a little bit about the New South Wales beer, the Reshers. They were brothers as well, weren't they?
Yeah, look, most of those pubs or the big ones, Castlemaine. Castlemaine's an interesting one. Now, of course, it's Castlemaine. It's a famous beer in Queensland, but actually started its life as Castlemaine because it was in Victoria, where Castlemaine is what they say. Yeah. And that was started by 2 Irish brothers who, and then it amalgamated into a huge conglomerate of Carlton United and a whole pile of breweries that got together. But the funny thing is, the great trivia question, what was 4X called before it was 4X? And sadly, it was called 3X. It was a beer that Foster's brewed called 3X, and then they changed the recipe. And of course, now it's how Queenslanders spell beer.
Yeah,
but that's how 4X came about.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of different moments in history with that kind of. There was Brisbane Bitter popped up for a while there. I'm not sure if that was with the Powers family, but it was something that was, and it didn't last very long. It was Bulimba Bitter, Brisbane Bitter, and Brisbane Bitter used to get called, and would have been a marketing nightmare. They used to call it Brisbane River.
Right.
That's what I reckon it tasted like.
Well, there were breweries in all the larger country towns. There was Mudgee Mud, and there was the beer at Grafton had a reputation. That gets a mention in the pub with no beer, because the bloke who couldn't get a beer moved on to Grafton because there's a brewery there where the brewery stands near. And the wonderful story again by Ken Cook in the book is The Drunken Kangaroo.
Yeah.
which is about when his dad was a police sergeant at Brewarrina in way up. I can't imagine Brewarrina having its own brewery, but it did. And the pet kangaroo who lived next door to them became an alcoholic because he started eating all the waste product, the slops from the brewery. A very funny story.
That tells some of these towns have still got their soft drink.
Yes.
There's soft drink operations.
Yep.
They're still,
Yeah.
Morey's got
Yeah,
one.
Morey. I was trying to think, what is it?
And there's a Koala company in Burke too.
Kirk's, I think, that's another rural one. But yeah, they did that. It was a lot more local in those days. You had, not only the things that you couldn't get any other way, like the butcher and the baker, because it was too far to go to get. The meat would have been rotten and the bread stale. But they also, towns did have their own breweries and their own soft drink companies, and it's all changing now.
Mm. Now, tell us what do you have anything in mind after this? I mean, you've done your racing stories, and Spring Carnival just finished this year. It's always a busy time for a punter, but there's have you done any other particular Australian sports?
No, I haven't. I've been tempted to do tennis and AFL, and many years ago I did a whole album of supposed comedy songs about rugby league for Festival Records just before they went out of existence. It probably had a bit to do with it, but I think the problem racing is the two sports that you can write about endlessly in Australia are racing and cricket, because cricket fans and racing tragics read books. They're if you're a cricket fan or a racing fan, you're into numbers and statistics and history, and they tend to read books, whereas maybe tennis wouldn't have enough people across the general public, and
rugby league fans prefer variety shows on
well,
half an hour
yes,
on Sunday night.
Yes. Now, I did write a book called the ABC Book of Australian Country Music, which they thought was a very good idea, but I did have an editor at the time who shall remain nameless, Stuart Neal, who when this idea came up said, well, do you think that country music fans read? And then he hesitated and added books.
Yeah.
But it turned out that he was quite right. Country music people buy CDs. You've got to understand your market. And that book didn't exactly get me to the French Riviera. So,
well, hopefully this one does.
Well, I hope so too, because I have some lovely wine over there. I could keep researching for volume 2.
Yeah. Great wino stories. Thanks for talking to us today. I think this will be, like I said, a staple in stockings and on coffee tables around the country come Christmas Day. And there's plenty of stories in there. As we said before, the 100 stubby bet in Cooper Pedy is one to get onto and find out what happened to him.
And some funny poems too, about homebrew and various other things to maybe go there with the history, which gets a bit if you want to understand the way we are today. A few of the little history lessons in there about our association with alcohol might give you an insight.
Yeah, there was one that I really liked about the about the guy who he came across a big dog, and then he decided that he was hungry and the dog was hungry, and he ordered up a couple pies.
Yes.
For him and the dog.
That is a very old story that used to be anthologised all the time. It's called The Lobster and the Lioness by Ernest O'Farrell. And one of the joys of what I do, and there's no profit in it really, but he's been forgotten. Ernest O'Farrell was completely... He used to write the Chundaloo ads for Cobra boot polish that Norman Lindsay and Lionel Lindsay drew the pictures, which is where we get our word chunder. Chundaloo of Akim Fu was this Indian cartoon character who went to war in World War I and he saved us from all sorts of things, and he was a comic character. He would be completely, out today. You're politically incorrect to the nth degree. But it became rhyming slang in World War One between the soldiers. I'm going to have a chundaloo, which meant a spew, and then they just left off the loo bit, and so that's where we get our word chunder. But Ernest O'Farrell used to write the little poems that went with the ads that were drawn by Norman Lindsay, and it's a very funny story. It's an old-fashioned story, The Lobster and the Lioness, but it has a lot of chuckles.
Now, tell us, as someone who grew up in Sydney and kind of in the inner east, I guess you could say, went to school, did you ever meet anyone, that might have reminded you, like an iconic fictional character that came out of Sydney at that time was Les Norton. And he's a big hit in Western Queensland because that's where he's purportedly from before he ended up in Bondi as a gay nightclub bouncer and... could have been rugby league star. Did you ever meet anyone like that growing up?
I met characters growing up because I was hanging around racing stables even then, hanging around City Nichols Racing Stable, and I used to, clean out, and they pretended that I worked there. I think they gave me 10 bob or something. But there were real characters there, and particularly racing people. And what I realised is that the glamour of racing, with the Aga Khan and all these people, there's a hell of a lot of derelicts and deadbeats down the bottom working in stables. And but I think the character who I've made the most use of in all my writing, I have a character called Dipso Dan, who is the town drunk of Wheeler-Barraback, my little iconic hometown, which if you're looking for it, it's on the West Australia-New South Wales border. And... he's based on a very, very real bloke that I knew for 6 years in a country town where I was teaching, and very, very much based on that character, who was an incredibly tragic character and a very funny bloke because he was the town drunk. That was his position in life, and he went about it very seriously. And I've written a lot about Dipso Dan, comedy and some, true stories as well, but I've always disguised the character. I've never let on who he actually was, but if people who know where I was teaching might be able to work it out for themselves.
And that's where you think you found a lot of undesirables in. Where would you say you'd meet the most kind of characters, in bush racing or in the city?
Oh, I think those. Racing's fairly across the board, I mean, you do meet the characters out in the bush who are racing identities, and one particular one who's on Fox who mangles the English language to the point where it's comedic. He can't make a sentence without mangling the language and changing tenses 5 times and using adjectives instead of adverbs. And I love that, but he's actually very good at what he does, and I back his tips quite often. So those people are out there more so in the bush, I think. And now in the city, racing's such a big business. You've really got to be on the ball, and it's full of fairly well-trained media people and so on, and they teach the jockeys now to speak very well. Remember in the old days when they used to interview the jockey, you never knew what it was. Well, he done good, and, but now they all seem to be able to speak and be interviewed and do it very well.
Yeah, they've got the footballer on the sideline type thing. They'll have their kids with them after a race. You know, it's kind of very wholesome compared to when they were back in the day having a durry and kind of looking a bit shifty.
Yes, the Tommy Rodonica school of... but you still get, with the footballers, I think the AFL do a pretty good job of, media training for their footballers. Rugby league can still be a bit rough around the edges at times, and of course most of the soccer coaches they can't speak English at all. So, you don't know.
And they're passionate too.
Very.
They're yelling. Well, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure,
Jim.
It was fun.
You've written, what was it,
26
books, and there's something there for everyone. So you should start with this one, Best Australian Drinking Stories by Jim Haynes. it's all good bookstores.
And even the bad ones.
Yeah, and the bad
Yep.
ones.
I don't think there are any bad ones left now.
I think they're called the post office now.
Yes, well, my books do get in the post office, and they're also on the website, of course, and got a special deal: buy two, get one free this Christmas, and give them to Uncle Fred.
Mm-hmm. Uncle Fred. Uncle Fred is the archetype. He's the core demo.
And he'll love it too.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.
a lot.
And that was Jim Haynes, hell of a storyteller there. He's got plenty of stories, and it sounds like he's got a fair few more in mind after this one. So we hope he finds the time and the creative juices to get through all of those ones. Personally, I'd like to see a great Australian newsroom journalism, behind-the-scenes type story. And I'm sure he's learned a lot in his time in the pubs, because that's where you're going to hear all those yarns. Or else you could just go see the Batuta Advocate Roadshow the next time we go on tour, but that won't be happening for a while. So thanks to everyone who did come out and see us. We had a great time seeing all the different corners of this country, and we are surprisingly heading into Christmas with a few extra kilos. So expect to see a more plump Errol Parker and Clancy Overall in the new year. Anyway, that's it for this week. We hope you are enjoying the early days of December. We see the decorations are already up in the shops, and we're going to get bombarded with Christmas right through. So enjoy yourselves. Be kind to each other. I'm Clancy Overall. You're listening to the Batuta Advocate Radio Show. Please stay out of the pokies.